About 1 year ago, I painted 3 identical models in 3 different time trials: a 10-hour, a 1-hour, and a 10-minute test, exploring how a paint process changes based on the length of time we give ourselves to paint our minis. Let's do the typical YouTuber thing where I copy an old video that did well in hopes that lightning strikes twice. Today we'll be painting some Vikings from one of my favorite board games from Cool Mini or Not, Blood Rage, which is a name that screams, we hit the randomize button in a hardcore name generator and pick the first result we got, like Blackened Hate or Angry Disemboweled Gut Rot. Okay, maybe more thought was put into this game name than I thought. With some model cleanup and prep complete, including dealing with some pretty epically bendy plastic, we could get into the painting. Let's see how our steps change based on our time allotment. We're beginning with the 10-hour trial, which is different than last time. Previously, I began with a 10-minute test, which, in hindsight, is pretty dumb. Starting with a longer test is good because it allows me time to spend exploring the model. I can develop a good scheme over the course of painting this first mini that I can apply to future models, allowing for better comparisons to be made, which segues us into the first obvious benefit of the 10-hour test. I have more time.
Duh.
With that time, I can experiment. I can paint slowly and carefully, but let's be more specific. I can repaint parts of the model with this time to fix problems. You'll notice that I paint the eyes of this model several times before it's good enough for me. I can also include some special effects like a rosy red complexion to complement the wintry Viking theme of the model and purple bags under his eyes. This guy is an older warrior and he's probably seen some shit, so let's make him look the part with a bit of exhaustion. With more time, I can spend more time improving the sculpt with my paint. This model's hair is very defined to the point where it's difficult to paint. This often happens when the original master of the model is hand sculpted, like this one is. I'm widening each strand of hair to something closer to heroic scale hair, which is not realistic, but is easier to paint, which then looks nicer. In some cases, I'm creating strands of hair where none exist, or at least none that I can see. You can see how the original sculpt compares to how I chose to paint the model. In the same vein as the hair, I also gave my character fingernails by starting with a dark color and then layering on a brighter tan color and then eventually white. The dark color here acts as my recessed shade, which makes the model appear as though it originally had fingernails as part of the sculpt. More time impacts the paint range I'm choosing as well. Because I'm not opting to apply a wash to the majority of this model for shading, I'm choosing a more matte paint range like AK Interactive, Chimera, or Scale 75. This paint is slightly harder to work with because of that aforementioned finish, but it allows for more control specifically over lighting. My paint won't be reflecting the environmental light as much and instead show off my paint decisions better. In general, when I have more time, I take a more manual approach to miniature painting so that I have more control over the end product. I did apply a wash to the cloak, however, because even with 10 hours, manually applying shading to all the fur of this cloak would eat up too much time. I did go through the trouble of applying highlights to all the bits of fur, however. With more time, I'm also mixing more often, which again lends more control. I'm looking for a specific hue, and if I don't own a pre-mixed version of it, or more realistically, it's not within 2 feet of me at any given moment, I'll just mix what I need. With more time, I'm stressing a bit less. I'm taking my time to make sure my base coats begin and end where the detail begins and ends. Sometimes a detail like this belt on his chest will be a little thicker, so I make sure that I'm painting the top and the sides of that 3D detail with my initial base coat. Make sure to drop your model in white paint to really make the most of your time. It's a pretty advanced technique, so I understand if you don't get it. Why couldn't it have been literally any other color than titanium white? With more time, I'm employing techniques that aren't super time friendly, like glazing on this wooden scabbard to introduce some shading toward the bottom. A wash wouldn't collect like this applying it normally, so I'm leveraging glazing to get my effect, which again takes longer but lends more control. With more time, I'm experimenting more as well. For the true metallic metals of this figure, I employed a Payne's Gray oil wash, and while it wasn't perfect, I learned a lesson. I learned that I can't rush oil washes, and I need to let them set up a bit before I wipe them away with mineral spirits. If I don't, I end up soaking up all that dark color in the deep parts of the model as well as the high parts. I'm breaking up various cloth elements of this figure to help it read better, like adding a blue stripe at the border of this cream-colored tunic. This introduces my cold color temperature more, but also shows the viewer better where one detail ends and another begins. In general, I'm using more colors. Here's my selection of paint supplies from the 10-hour version compared to my 1-hour version. I can break up more elements of this sculpt, which allows me more leg room to explore inside this paint scheme I've picked, but it also makes the model look more pleasant. I'm not saying that more colors makes for a better scheme. But for me, being able to choose from more colors allows for a more nuanced paint scheme. 10 hours isn't enough time to do everything, however. For instance, instead of painting the beaks of the ravens to look glossy with matte paints, I just coated them in Mod Podge Dimensional Magic. Any glossy medium or varnish would work in this situation. That trick gets me the effect that I'm going for, a black that is distinct from the feathers without the hassle of trying to convey shininess on the beak of a 32mm bird, which also really isn't sculpted the greatest either. I also chose to do TMM instead of non-metallic metals NMM because I felt like it would take way too long to get all these little bits of chainmail, scale mail, pommels, guards, and decorative bits looking right. I did, however, apply multiple highlights to both my silver and copper elements. I actually ended up being pretty proud of the spear tip that I painted on this model. I want to show you guys how I did it in one of those longer, unedited videos that I've done in the past, examples linked in the top right-hand corner of the screen. If you want to catch my painting process live, I was actually painting the TMM of this model on Twitch. I stream on Tuesdays now from 1 to 4 p.m. CST, link in the description. Here's the completed 10-hour version. I was experimenting with my extra time by using two contrasting hues, blue and orange, in a big way on this model. I find when doing that, the result can often look a little gaudy, but this model is looking okay. With less time, I wouldn't feel as comfortable making artistic risks like this because I wouldn't have the time required to make mistakes and then fix those issues. Now, I have a proven paint scheme that I know will look pretty good, so I'm not having to spend that extra mental energy while also finishing the paint job in 1 hour or 10 minutes. While painting, I was also taking notes, which is a new habit that I'm trying to form. So if you guys want to know what specific paints that I'm using, they'll be listed down in the description below. Before moving on, though, let's hear a word from our sponsor. Snot Goblin Gaming is bringing modular terrain to the hobby community. I'm not much of a terrain guy, but even the amount of terrain that I own can feel like it's taking up too much room compared to my minis. What if Legos and hobby terrain had a sprue gray baby, though? I think that might look a little disturbing. Introducing modular, collapsible wargaming terrain. This is not a 3D printable file, but a precision-engineered push-fit collection of terrain. Not only does it make storage easier because the terrain breaks down, but it also expands your terrain collection because each piece can be assembled in a variety of ways. Everything was designed to be compatible with the terrain layouts of all the major tournament circuits, so if you're prepping for your next LVO, you're covered. For $199, you get about 5 times as much terrain as you see here with enough modularity to change it up as often as you'd like. Big thanks go to Snot Goblin Gaming for sponsoring this episode. To pick up their terrain kit, check out the Kickstarter linked in the description below. September 8th is the end date, so pick up a kit while you have time. Alright, let's clean up my area and get set up for the 1 hour test. Because I plan to leverage washes more in this scenario, I'm going to pick similar hues compared to my first mini, but with brands that have more of a satin finish, like Vallejo or Ammo from Mig Jimenez or Citadel. With a more satin paint range, not only do we get poppier colors when compared to their matte counterparts, but also a wash will perform better as the surface is more slippery, causing the wash to break surface tension more easily. Additionally, a little bit of light reflectivity is a good thing for a paint job where you're trying to cut corners while still maintaining quality. Similar to using a glossy medium on the beaks of the ravens in trial number 1, having a satin finish do some of the highlighting legwork simply because it reflects the environmental light of any given room is a positive and helpful characteristic. If you've been around the channel for any amount of time, this 1 hour speed paint will follow a similar set of steps that I've outlined in the video I've linked in the top right hand corner of the screen. Essentially, I'm painting this zenithly undercoated model in transparent layers of acrylic paint. It's kind of like I'm painting this model with contrast paint, but instead of washing it onto the model and having it collect in the recesses, I'm wicking off the excess paint and applying only a filter of color. By separating the two steps, base coating and shading, I gain some creative control. I now am able to pick whatever color the shade will be versus being pigeonholed into whatever color an instant paint might produce at the cost of it taking longer. With the base coats applied, barring the metallics, I started to wash the model. For the darker cloth elements, I used a matte black wash, but for the other parts, I used a matte brown wash, exercising that aforementioned freedom to mix up my shading color. With the wash all dry, I began to apply some highlights using a combination of mixing paint, but also using pre-mixed solutions. The rule of thumb for this process is the closer the detail is to the face of the model, the more highlights it receives and the brighter it becomes. His face, hair, and shoulders should be the brightest and most visually attractive parts of the model if I do this right. This allows me to skimp on the rest of the model, saving me time. The hope here is that the viewer will spend their time looking at the parts of the model that I'm putting effort into. I didn't really have a lot of time to redo the eyes on this model, so I had to go with my first shot, but it's worth mentioning that order of operations matters. You notice how the white of the eye is getting onto his lower eyelid, making his right eye look much larger than his left. Instead of immediately fixing that, I paint in the black pupil, which I also make a bit too large. With some skin color highlight, I then repaint the lower eyelid, fixing both mistakes simultaneously. Sometimes in using this painting method, you might notice that the white undercoat is still showing through after base coating the model, maybe more than you'd like it to show through. I like to paint over that often with my highlight colors to not only highlight the model, but also increase the saturation. I'm not obscuring the brightness of the model, just giving it a different, more saturated color. I find that with this approach, the model can feel much less lively when compared to what I consider a more normal approach to mini painting, and I explained why that was the last time I did this 10-hour, 1-hour, 10-minute test linked above. I proceeded with my test, highlighting details by the face 2 to 4 times, whereas other details got a maximum of 2 highlights, or sometimes even none. For parts of the model like the boots, for example, a simple base coat and wash is good enough. Here's the result of the 1-hour trial. You can see how the paint scheme is more drab than the 10-hour, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It all kind of depends on what you're going for. I feel like there are certain elements like the cream tunic and the desaturated blue undershirt that look very comparable to the 10-hour version, and maybe on future models, I'll consider a less intense painting process for colors and details such as these. Alright, on to the 10-minute trial, which I am prepared to fail hopelessly at. Last time, a lot of you asked why I didn't use something like contrast paint for the 10-minute trial, and I'm about to show you why. I primed this model in white to test out the Army Painter's speed paint. I began by figuring out which speed paints best replace the paints in my own scheme. I also set up all the paints in front of me in a weld palette so I wouldn't be wasting any time. It was actually a bit hard to tell which paint was which in a weld palette, so I arranged the paints nearby as a visual guide. We've now discovered a reason why GW's paint pots might be better than dropper bottles in one instance, and now we will never hear the end of it from raving GW fanboys. Alright, you Space Marine fanboys, listen up. The lesson for today is that paint pots are better than dropper bottles because with contrast paints, you can't put them inside of a weld palette. Hey, pay attention! So you want to keep it to be in the pot so you understand, are we taste testing the new contrast paints today or what? Yeah, are we? Alright, enough foreplay, let's start slapping on some paint. This is going to be a really interesting comparison. I wonder if there's anything a more automatic solution like speed paint can replace in my more hardcore painting methods. It's worth mentioning that this is only 10 minutes of painting, and a paint range like this can definitely look better if you take your time and apply the paint more thoughtfully, so the comparison isn't going to be perfect. There isn't a whole lot to discuss with the actual application of paint, as I'm not incredibly familiar with this style, but also it's pretty transparent in its application. Sorry for the terrible art jokes. I did, however, learn a pretty valuable lesson. I think these types of paints, contrast paints from GW, speed paints from Army Painter, and instant paints from Scale 75, benefit from smooth brushstrokes. To be more specific, the less you are touching down and taking off from the model with the brush, the better. Less short jabby jabs, more long strokey strokes. You agitate the drying paint less, but you also allow the paint to do its job more, settling where it wants to. Don't get me wrong, sometimes pushing around translucent paint like this is necessary, just like a wash, but the less of it you're doing, the better. At the end of 10 minutes, this is where I got to. I didn't finish the model, and this should illustrate why contrast paint isn't the right approach for a strict 10-minute paint job. On the last test, I primed the entire model black and just painted whatever I could get to, and while I also didn't finish the model in that trial, it still looks done, and that's simply because of the black undercoat. The white undercoat is more obviously not painted. For a model this detailed, there is no world where I get my brush on everything and have it not look like a massacre in 10 minutes. Maybe that's on me for not picking a simpler figure, but it's still an interesting result. I finished the model in another 12 minutes of painting, bringing my total to 22 minutes, a far cry from 10, but what was necessary to make all those white spots not stick out like a sore thumb. Metallics also don't look great over a white undercoat unless you spend time making sure they're really opaque, which is a luxury we don't really have in this test. Here are all 3 trials compared. I think the differences are pretty obvious. No part of the 10-minute test is jumping off the model as an obvious replacement for a process that takes longer but also looks better, other than maybe the fur cloak. Do you think that, though? Just because I prefer a certain end result doesn't mean that you have to. I think it'd be interesting to do a 4th model where I combine various elements of each paint job to see how long a min-maxed paint scheme would take. I like the face and hair of the 10-hour paint job, the cloak of the 10-minute, the tunic of the 1-hour, etc. Maybe we can do that on the next attempt if that sounds interesting to you. I think probably the biggest observation I made that was in the 10-minute trial, I was stressed and rushing. I didn't even finish on time. In the 10-hour test, I was relaxed and having fun with the paint job. It's worth stating that most people aren't going to paint within a specific time period, but if you're constantly thinking about time and whether or not you're wasting it on any given part of the model, you're probably experiencing less joy during the painting process. This is a hobby. The main goal is to have fun. If you can identify the way you have fun, whether it's in the process or it's outcome dependent, just focus on that. This test was inspired by my Patreon Discord, actually. Every quarter, we have a challenge that awards bonus points toward the Paint More Minis leaderboard. At the moment, the quarterly challenge is this exact test. So if you want to participate, hop on the Discord, which you can access through being a Twitch subscriber or a member of my Patreon, both things linked below. If you want to participate but you can't afford to be a member, that's no problem. I've linked the rules for the challenge down in the description below. You just won't get any fake internet points for it. Also, as a patron of this channel, you get access to the Supercut edition of this video. I take all the footage that I recorded for this painting process, speed it up, and over the course of 30 minutes to an hour, I talk about the painting process. So if there's a part of any of these models or past videos that I didn't explain fully, becoming a patron and watching the Supercut edition of any given video might answer your question. Much love goes to my patrons for supporting me not only with their money, but also participating in fun experiments like this and essentially being guinea pigs for all sorts of different ideas over the years. They enable me to make crunchy, nerdy video topics like this without worrying about getting a ton of views because the support is already there. Thanks, team. That'll do it for this video, guys. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to watch another video just like this, I have it linked in the top right-hand corner of the screen and also below. If you like the channel and you want to support it, there are many ways to do that. All things linked down in the description, namely buying my model, the Duchess, and also a digital course that goes along with it that teaches you how to paint the model brushstroke for brushstroke. Subscriber time! But most importantly, don't forget to paint more Miniac!